Hey guys, I wanted to touch a little bit more on some of the dyeing process. We did a video not too long ago about some of the different types of dyes, but I just wanted to show you some of them in action and some of the different ways you can apply them because there's some different things you can do to give different textures and that kind of thing. Also wanted to talk about one of the big factors in the color that you end up having at the end of the day, and that is the base leather color that you begin with. So if you have an older piece of leather that's seen sun, or it's just already has a decent tan from the animal, or it hasn't been exposed to harsh chemicals like some of the lighter ones, it can already be a darker color, which is why I was talking about in the last video why some of the dyes end up coming on off colors, because if you don't start out with something white, you start out with something that's kind of cream or pink or tan, then obviously, like if you're going for a yellow, it's not going to come out bright yellow. It's really hard to get light colors with dyes. And some of the healthier hides are kind of a tan color anyway. Like I said, the lighter ones are usually exposed to harsher chemicals, so they're a little harder to work with, but it's kind of one of those give and take things. But if you're doing like a black or sometimes browns, you can use whatever color leather you want because it'll pretty much kind of just fade into the rest of that. But let me show you a couple of the different application methodologies here so we can get a couple different looks. This is an alcohol-based brown. It's a Phoebene's light brown. What we're going to do is we're going to apply it with linear strokes because we're going to go for kind of a wood grain. Now, the easiest way to get a even color is to oversaturate something. Basically, you put enough of it on there to where the pigment can't get any darker. But if you want it to look hand-dyed or you want it to look kind of textured, then putting it on with a dauber is really one of your better methodologies. And if you use uneven, and when I say uneven, I mean like I'm moving it around, linear strokes, you kind of come up with this wood grain kind of look once you're done. Personally, I prefer the water-based stuff just because it's a little more subtle. With the alcohol, you have a very light dark, because it's a very stark pigment. So I'm going to do the same thing again with a water base, and you can kind of see the difference. This is Tandy's Echo Flow Java Brown. It's a little more of a washed out color because it is a water base and not an alcohol base, which gives you a little more earthy kind of look anyway. And we're going to do kind of the same thing. As you make your lines, your dauber ends up with less and less actual dye on it. So it's good to like do your first one in one spot and then move completely somewhere different, so you don't hit the same spot with a real heavy amount of dye on your dauber multiple times, because you want it to look kind of random. And the lighter ones make that wood grain look quite a bit more subtle, and as it dries it'll kind of intensify too, because while it's wet you can pretty obviously see where your dauber started. So you can see how the color just pops so much. And this is a lighter brown any way you look at it. But even with the same pigment between water base and alcohol base, you end up with a much more pop of color with the alcohol base stuff. There's a couple different ways you can do it as well. Like if you're doing something that is black or a blue or kind of a muted stone color, you can do what we like to call impact daubing. And with that, it's the same general idea that you're kind of randomizing the dye a little bit, but instead of doing linear strokes, you're just going to basically dab. And like I said, when you start out, you got a lot of dye on your dauber, and so it's going to be a real dark spot. But as you go, there's less and less dye. And as it becomes less dye, you end up with a faded spot. So once you've got it completely covered, you end up with kind of a marbled look. So if you're trying to make it look stone-like almost, then the impact daubing really works out well. And this goes well with the stains as well. Especially there's a color called slate gray that I like to use a lot with the water stains. and it very much makes it look like stone. And you kind of want to go around sort of randomly, but make sure you get everything pretty well covered. And you can do this with blues and reds. I wouldn't do it with the alcohol-based stuff just because it's, you know, when you think of marble, you don't think of like bright poppy colors. And it'll be darker while it's wet. As it gets drier, it'll lighten up some. But now you have kind of this marbled look. For bright colors, you know, if you're just doing, you know, something pretty and decorative, a lot of times I just like to do the swirl effect, especially if it's like blues, because it kind of gives you this cloud look almost. A lot of times dyeing methodologies that people will try and talk you into are based on trying to get even colors, which, you know, there's plenty of times in which you want to get even colors, but it's also worth remembering that you can always dunk dye something to get an even color. And if you're buying pre-dyed leather, it obviously comes as an even color. So if you want to advertise the fact that, hey, this is hand dyed, then you almost don't want it to be super even, because then it's kind of like the blacksmiths leaving hammer marks intentionally in their work. You know, they want you to know that they did it by hand. So it has its own kind of, you know, artistry to have a little bit of irregularity in the dye job. Well, the last thing I think I'm going to do, I've got several different, I got water stain, alcohol-based stuff, oil-based stuff, water-based stuff. I'm going to put a bunch of these on different pieces side by side, so you can see the difference between like a water-based green and a alcohol-based green, and an oil-based brown and an alcohol-based brown, so on and so forth. But I'm just going to slather these on there, and then I'll give you a recap of which one's which. All right, so the first big difference to notice is the difference between the light leather and the dark leather. If you remember, I had some pretty bleach white leather, and I had some that were kind of tan, and then some were a little bit pink. This is the same dye. This is the alcohol-based brown that we use, and this is the water-based brown that we use. This is a light piece of leather, this is a light piece of leather, and this is our more cream-colored one. If you'll notice, the dye came out just a touch darker with the water base, and it came out quite a bit darker with the alcohol base in this cream-colored one. The other thing is that it kind of obscured, being a little bit darker, kind of obscured my wood grain look for the water base. This one don't have a real great basis for comparison for the darkness. This is just an oil-based one, but if you kind of compare it to like the alcohol base, for example, it's almost like washed out. It's almost like faded, and that's kind of the trend with just most oil-based dyes in general. One of the biggest differences is the tan to the bleached white in the greens. The stains don't really change a whole lot, but you can actually tell there's a little bit of difference. This one's the bleached white piece. This is a water-based stain, and it is definitely a little bit lighter on the white, but like the Pro is just drastically different from the tan piece to the bleach piece. The alcohol came out pretty close to the same. It's obviously a little bit darker on the tan, but the alcohol has that starker pigment, so it almost comes through a little bit easier, a little bit better for when you're using tanned leather. And this is obviously the H2O one that we used where we did the swirl, but because we did the swirl, we kind of put it on there a bit gently, so it almost came out neon, pretty bright. One of the biggest differences on the other one is the alcohol-based to water-based black. Like, obviously, you don't really want to compare the light part, just because this is oversaturated, the alcohol-based is. So really, what you would compare is the darker spots on the marbled kind of look. But even so, the darker alcohol-based dye obviously came out a lot darker than the water-based stuff. So the reds come up in the similar way where the tanner leathers produce darker colors. You see that really the most with the water-based dyes. With this one, you can almost see some of that white coming through where I laid it on a little bit thinner. Whereas with the darker one, it seems like more of a solid color, but it is a slightly darker pigment. The Pro, I think that almost came out like you almost have a pinkish hue for the Pro. even though you still have kind of this rust color on the tanner one. The one that doesn't change, well, it doesn't change as much as the other ones, is the stain, because it's more of a topical based pigment. It still is a touch lighter on the white leather, but for the most part it just kind of holds its own color because it's resting on top of the leather. Something I really wanted to show more than just those, because that's pretty self-explanatory: lighter leather, lighter pigment; darker leather, darker pigment. But in the like fluorescent and the really bright colors, like I was talking about before, how it's really hard to get like your yellows and your pinks and that kind of stuff, just because you're not starting with a white base. When you come to the fluorescent colors, if you use the stains, because they sit on topically, you can still kind of maintain some of that real bright color. This is turquoise and fuchsia of the EcoFlow water stains, and on this really tan piece of leather, you can still tell it kind of turned a little bit green in comparison to the white leather, and then the fuchsia turned almost like a rust red. But for the most part, for trying to get to a color that's this bright, they still held up decently well. But even so, like if you were trying to really get to these colors, you'd want to use this whiter kind of leather, because those really seem to pop out when you use those stains. So I hope this was helpful for you. If you'd like to see more videos like this, be sure to like and subscribe. And the next couple ones we'll be going through some tools and some basic processes to impart a little more leatherworking knowledge on you. So hopefully we'll see you in the next ones.